publishing. The fair and the programs are free and open to the public, so please consider joining their membership program to help pay artist fees and keep these events free and accessible. We'll share that link in the chat to sign up. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the Vancouver Art Book Fair does take place on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm streaming here from my home in the Bay Area on the land stewarded by the xʷməthkwəy people. And as we're here to talk about books and publishing, I also want to acknowledge the very many histories and languages and knowledges that have been erased through the prioritization of paper as being the source of history, legitimacy, and value. So these 2 days of programs, I hope will offer a way to understand how publishing can really be a site of resistance, restoration, contestation, and imagination as well. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce artist Ken Lum and curator and writer Kim Nguyen, who are going to be discussing Ken's latest book, Everything is Relevant, Writings on Art and Life, 1991 to 2008. And this was published by Concordia Press earlier this year. We'll be collecting questions for the two of them, so please feel free to drop those in the chat at any time. Ken explores issues of identity, immigration, language, and spatial politics through a wide range of media, including painting, sculpture, performance, video, photography, and critical writing. His artistic practice often raises questions that are left unanswered, prompting viewers to decipher potential solutions to universal concerns. He's a prolific writer and an active curator, co-curating the Shanghai Modern 1919 to 1945, the Sharjah Biennial 7, and Monument Lab Creative Speculations for Philadelphia. And his art has been widely exhibited since the 1970s. Kim Nguyen is a writer and curator based in San Francisco, where she is the curator and head of programs at the Tsleil-Waututh Institute. Recent and upcoming exhibitions include Jeffrey Gibson, Nothing is Eternal, Cynthia Marcel A. Morta, Akosua Adoma Owosu, Welcome to the Jungle, Abbas Akavan, Cast for a Folly, and Ken Lum, What's Old is Old for a Dog. And recently, Kim led the Waututh's 6th research season dedicated to the work of Trinh T. Minh Ha. Her writing has appeared in exhibition catalogs and periodicals nationally, internationally, and she is currently completing her first collection of writings. Welcome, Ken and Kim.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Vivian. Yeah, it's very exciting. Thank you to the Vancouver Art Book Fair and Vivian for inviting us to do this conversation. You know, it's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to spend time with Ken. I feel like he and I hadn't seen each other in person in a long time now, like maybe over a year. And then when you add the pandemic to that, that's basically 7 years. So it's been a long time. But I want to start just first by, thanking Ken, not only for generously spending this time with us here today, but also for his existence and for remaining in our collective imagination. For many of my peers, and myself, your work and your words and your scholarship have just been such an incredible influence to us in ways that we're still learning about and feeling each day. So I just want to express how grateful we are for you, just to start things off. Considering the context of this book fair, I think we were tasked with discussing your new book, Everything is Relevant, Writings on Art and Life from 1991 to 2018. It's right here. And as Vivian mentioned, it was just published this past January by Concordia University Press. If you haven't picked it up, I really hope all of you watching do. It's a wonderful collection of texts and so many different pieces of writing that Ken has produced over the years, ranging from diary entries to catalog essays, articles, theoretical texts, curatorial statements. And the writing really tracks the many facets of Ken's practice, which has included curating and publishing, and also working in a multitude of different cultural and geographic contexts that I think he's moved in and out of. When Ken and I met briefly to talk about this conversation, he had expressed that he's grown a bit weary of talking about the book because this is his 12,000th webinar on it. So I think instead of speaking directly to the book itself, we're going to kind of spend this time talking alongside of it. But I would really encourage everyone to check out some of the other previous conversations that Ken has done about the book. A lot of them are online. The conversation between him and Kitty Scott that was presented on the occasion of this book's launch is a really great one, and that one can be found on Concordia University Press's YouTube channel. So I think just to start, firstly, I just kind of want to ask, how are you doing? The question feels so loaded in this current context, and I think none of us really know how to respond, but in earnest, I just, how are you doing? How have you been doing during this time?
Well, my first response is, just before starting this session, as we are now, I thought we were on the wrong day, so I thought I thought this was a Saturday, so that's how I'm doing. It just seems, and I'm sure I know I'm not the first person to comment at how Groundhog Day, the movie, has been so kind of prescient of this moment, and it is kind of fatiguing, not being to lose track of time and so on. But then on the other hand, losing track of time maybe it's a good thing to lose, because at least I know for you, it's also busy, and myself, keeping to time has always been a point of pride, and I sometimes think, why, right? It's just the way lives have been. It's not about life; it's about just the time clock and so on. So, but I'm doing fine. Yeah, I'm glad to be with my family at home.
Yes, yeah, that definitely makes a big difference for sure. I think everyone's relationship to time has changed so much over these past few months, and I kind of wish that some people would more actively change their relationship to time, and as being people who are so bound to a clock in a way, and obviously what that clock represents in relationship to capital and like all productivity and all of these things. I'm hoping that we'll do away with more clocks actually in the coming months as well. So to talk a bit about just, to casually still tie it to the book, your preface in the book just kind of talks a lot about how you arrived at art and becoming an artist. It details your childhood, when and how you first encountered art, and this kind of like non-linear path that you took with your studies, while also providing details about your family and about economic hardships, and also these moments of vulnerability, about feeling a bit lost or like depressed at times because you couldn't quite figure out, what path you wanted to take. And in a recent interview you did with Amy Fung for Canadian Art, you remarked, "I have never hidden where I'm from." And this is something that I've always appreciated about your work and how you contextualize it, because it's so unabashedly about difference and about race, and so forcefully about class, speaking about clocks and like all of these things related to capital, and so many of these like personal integrations in your writing really outline the necessities that are born out of class, and that the world as we live it, it can't be ignored in who we are and how we make. And I think I appreciate this about when you write, because it's not as if you put on a certain mask and then you keep it. It kind of moves in, vacillates in and out of these modes. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, but one of the things that has always resonated with me about the work and your writing is that it has like a kind of profound loneliness to it, to me, and I think growing up working class from immigrant families, and then ending up in this like world of aesthetics and privilege and like a kind of wealth that I don't think we could have imagined being near, really. It can be also like so deeply alienating on like a day-to-day basis. So just to start with such like a big question, but like how do you negotiate these different versions of yourself, like the who you are and who you always will be, but also this other you that we had to become, or that we are superficially or partially. Like how do you kind of navigate those two selves, I guess?
Right. I mean, that's a tough question, because it's true. I've never hidden who I am or where I come from, but that was partly because there's no hiding spots for me. I mean, I look the way I do, you look the way you do, and so that was one factor, right? And the other factor was that like I couldn't pass off as as not Asian. I couldn't,
Yeah.
and so on. And then I realized very early on that I didn't have the formation to pass off as not being from my roots, my class, and so on. I remember very early on, I had a dinner, and this was probably one of my first occasions in Europe. I never went to Europe until I was almost in my late 20s. Right? People kind of always surprised me. They said, "Well, you traveled so much." Yeah, I traveled so much after a certain point, well into my adulthood. I started to travel, and so on. And for that, I'm grateful to be an artist in the art system that afforded me the opportunity to travel. But I remember one occasion being at this fancy dinner and in Belgium, and a major collector, and I sat next to the major collector, so spouse, and they had all these forks and knives and so on. I really felt lost because I didn't know you had to pick the outside utensils first. I didn't know what the roles of spoons were and so on. And so I just decided, well, I'll just be honest about it. Say, well, I'm not sure which one I use for this dish. And then the person next to me, the spouse, the collector, she's also a collector, said, well, basically, like, I can't believe this, and never spoke to me the rest of the evening. I just thought I was like I don't know, some kind of lumpen something, right? And so, anyways, so I learned very early on that at some point I just couldn't hide it anyways, and so it was forced upon me. As much as I guess I have a certain character that just at some point I can't abide by certain codes, right? And and I found that especially true in Canada, to be honest. Like, there's an art system, and there's an expected ecology, and there's a certain idea of waiting your turn and being nice to certain people, and never really being explicit about anything. And then at some point, magically, you advance within it or something. So, but I never could stand that.
Yeah, there are a lot of unwritten rules that are materialized in many different forms. I think there is that idea that you have to you owe it to certain people, or you owe it to certain lineages, that there's like a certain path, there's a correct pathway or a way about doing things, which I think obviously is one that's like placed a lot upon BIPOC artists too, in terms of like being in line, and staying in line within that in order to achieve the success that you want. And I think that, it really speaks to how many unwritten rules there are navigating art, in this world where like, you can come to a dinner, but it doesn't mean you feel good about it.
Yeah, I sorry to interrupt, but I write about that quite often in my book, about these unwritten rules, and these codes we're supposed to somehow follow almost intuitively, right? We learn them socially and so on, right? But I just never could really abide by them. One thing that kept me going, Kim, I have to say, is very early on, I learned that art wasn't just about making art. Of course, that's important, right? Because it is fundamentally a material practice. But it was also about, how do you keep at making art? How do you pick yourself up during moments of disinterest or disillusionment and so on? And so, and a link to that was this idea that I had very early on, that life was it sounds romantic to say, but life being an artist was a lifelong calling, that the trajectory was for a long time, and that the measure of one's work was the oeuvre, as opposed to the single work or the series or the gallery show, and then you wait for the pundits to respond to the next gallery show. So I saw it as like, it's the total oeuvre, which includes not just the body of work one makes, but also the artist. I don't mean that in the sense of the character of the artist. I mean it in terms of what makes the artist interesting. Pitfalls and all. And so once I resolved that in my head, it was not that difficult for me to negotiate, no matter whatever the circumstance.
I think maybe expanding on that a bit too, I want to make reference to a story that you've talked about several times and that I probably expressed to you too many times in the past, how meaningful it is. And it's from your 2008 essay, To Say or Not to Say, where, it takes place in the mid 1980s at your opening in New York. And when your grandmother, who does not speak English, arrives unexpectedly and asks you repeatedly in Cantonese, like, who are all these people? And, it's like, it's really meaningful, I think, for me because of its emotional precision and the kind of explicit tension, between these selves and like what it means to, like what you're talking about, a type of wholeness, and what that means when you actually are whole and you're actually presented as such. But I think, it presents this opportunity to talk a bit more about visibility and how, in many ways, like we desire to be seen and heard and to be, and to be present and to be recognized as full and to be seen in this kind of complexity. But it's also a type of fullness that can be considered like an affliction, in this world as well. And I guess maybe we could talk a bit more about whether this separation is necessary to a survival kind of in the art world, or if visibility is always a trap, or if it's not.
Well, I think it's uneven. It's unevenly applied, right? So, obviously some artists can be as explicit as possible about who they slept with, or, like English.
Yeah. Some people are real messy. It's true.
Right. Or you can be a total Lucian, just get drunk and then have and then create all kinds of stories about how sad you are in a way, right, and so on. I mean, I'm thinking like my friend the late Martin Kipperberger. I mean, he was like just drinking. Wow, Martin, you're not going to survive very long, and he didn't, right, and so on. So certain things are about that are confessional, that are personal. They can be put on because they the art world likes to imagine those types of narratives or something, right? But other ones are meant to be, or at least my view is, they're meant to be somehow closeted. You're never supposed to bring them out, and so on, because they're too real. They're not larger than life. They're too, and I'm not sure, too even too kind of delicately touching and so on. Right. And so, and I don't have a system in terms of, the criteria for what is acceptable as a kind of personal story to be divulged and what is, right. I just know that for me, that was another side to me that was always there, that I just, it wasn't like I was hiding it, but it was just, when people ask me who I was, I'd say, well, my grandmother lives in Brooklyn and works in a sweatshop down near Tribeca, and I didn't hide that, right? But then that was a different story when she actually showed up, right? There was like a kind of unmasking going on, and I'm glad she showed up, actually, because I learned a lot from that as well. I learned how I learned never to kind of I learned never to not try to be my true self, my whole self, right? And I guess you play along, right, because you want to survive within the system. You're trying to learn things, and of course that's also an irony of the art system, because the art system likes to believe that art is this kind of transcendent practice that can touch on so many things that in non-art experiences nobody addresses. But that's also not true, and the art world itself has all kinds of filters that are in place as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this,
and especially, sorry to interrupt, but especially at that time. Now it's probably a bit more acceptable because there's many more artists of color and so on. I mean, I wrote that text in 2008, but that experience, that story didn't take place in 2008. It took place in 1986.
Yeah.
Right. So it took place in a much earlier time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing is, though, is that even though it took place in the 80s, which again, the extremes of that kind of context too, I think it resonates for a lot of people still, because I think of the negotiation of class, like the performance that we still have of even like pretending to be middle class. I think a lot of people aren't actually, and the kinds of performance that we have to do. And I think it just like really exposes that. And I think that moment is so interesting because it's both exposure and tenderness, you know, and there is this brief moment of like release or something when you just like, I'm actually relieved, you know, I'm relieved she came here. And then I don't like the kind of performance or the fraudulence also you can start to do away with it somehow too, because that burden that lingers, you don't realize how much of that you've internalized over the years as well.
But I see this, for example, because I teach, you know, in an Ivy League university, and all the undergraduates, not all, but most of them, let's say, are basically sons and daughters of captains of industry of the American Empire. So, you know, they went to prep schools and so on. Here I am, like the professor of these students. And then I also get a lot of inquiries from prospective students, and many of them were very tender, right? They come from, you know, developing parts of the world, you know, and they have a very earnest tone, and they've never traveled outside of where they are in Pakistan or whatever, in Africa and so on. And they say, oh, please, kind sir, I'm very interested in this program of yours and so on. I understand. And you know, it's just the kind of kindest, nicest letter, right? But it's also slightly out of touch because not through any fault of them, right? Because they're making an art that's very, let's just say, very local, very regional, and the contemporary art doesn't quite exist in the same way, at least at the pedagogical level, from where they are. So I'm always kind of, you know, in my job, in my everyday life, I'm always taking note of all these scenarios, right? Where you know, one moment I'm dealing with a kid who always wanted to be an artist, and so the parents you know, made a studio for her, and has traveled and seen all the museums basically around the world. Then you get one from, you know, another part of the world, and very earnest, but I would need really a lot of funding and so on. So I'm not sure what my point is, but I that's how I kind of look at. I guess I go through my day. I'm always curious, and I'm always thinking about how I'm an artist. Of course, I make art and so on, but I'm always thinking about these different subjectivities, which and I guess that's what interests me most. Just thinking about different subjectivities and how they and they're composite in the world.
Well, and the paths that are not so easily taken or so clearly outlined, you know, I think, you know, your career is a testament to that too, like that there's not always the correct pathway and the correct boxes to be checked that will lead you to the same destination somehow. But I think, you know, when we talked a bit last week, we wanted to talk a bit more about being Asian. You know, and I think throughout the book, you know, you talk a lot about sort of like the strangeness and frustration and sadness and a pride, you know, that goes with it. But like the kinds of things that you encounter or you would butt up against, you know, where there would be demands for you to be more of an Asian artist or be more Chinese, you know, whatever that means. And then simultaneously told that your work is not reflecting Canadian ideals. And then, you know, feeling a level of remove as well from Chinese artists, you know, as a member of the diaspora, and having like different concerns or relationship, whether it's to language or content, whatever that may be. And I think that, you know, it does speak a bit to this constant in-between position that Asians occupy, you know, like being both the racial bourgeoisie and yet still racialized at the same time. Mari Matsuda has written about this specifically within the US, but I think it's applicable elsewhere as well, where, you know, Asians occupy this racial middle, and it plays such a critical role at the same time, because it can reinforce white supremacy if, you know, if Asians are kind of deluding themselves into thinking that they can be white, you know, and they can be closer to white if they just try hard enough and work hard enough. And then at the same time, though, it can work to like dismantle white supremacy because it refuses to be in the middle, and it refuses to buy into that racial hierarchy, and kind of aligning instead with Black and Brown communities and forging those kinds of alliances. Can you talk more about how you've sort of navigated your own Asianness and this critical but also like potentially harmful flexibility of this subject position?
Well, I mean, you're speaking about comparative racism, right? And, you know, which, you know, and I wrote, by the way, I wrote, as you know, I wrote a screenplay about that. But in the 19th century, you know, being in the middle is not something that, you know, Asians or Asian artists chose to be positioned, right? That position was kind of attributed from the dominant rulers, right? So white people said, okay, you guys are in the middle, right? Because the seismic line being black, the polar opposite being black, and then you are the kind of triangulated in the middle somehow, right? And so and it was always even the idea of you know, the term that this kind of bourgeois Asian, you know, I mean, I wasn't bourgeois, you weren't bourgeois, right? And so on. But point well taken. It was always deemed, well, that's you know, it fell under the rubric of the model citizen, right? The Asians were the kind of model citizens, and it would be used as a kind of mallet against African Americans, namely, right? Like, look, they're model citizens. Why can't you be a model citizen? And so on. And but Asians themselves, by and large, never subscribed to that. That was always like white people speaking on behalf of Asians, right? Or speaking for Asians, I should say. And so on, right? But you know, if you go back historically, you know, especially anti-Chinese sentiment was on par with all, you know, the worst kinds of racism. You know, there was literally hundreds of massacres if you deemed in the 19th century, if you deem more than two a mass massacre, and so on. So you know, the largest group lynching was of Chinese Americans in LA in the latter part of the 19th century, and so on. So how do I negotiate that question? I negotiate it through my writing, I guess. I negotiate it through my art, and I negotiate it through, as we've been discussing, explicitly speaking about that, acknowledging that, you know, and so that's how you negotiate it, right? I don't know how. But I try to negotiate with some degree of pushback, you know, against those categories, right? Because those categories are stifling. It relates to, you know, what we just spoke about a moment ago about how, you know, there's a kind of typecasting of the Asian, or the Asian is supposed to comport themselves in a particular way that is not intrusive, that doesn't challenge the hierarchy of rule, and then you bide your time, right? And I mean, there is a kind of funny parallel, I guess. You know, I think back to my grandmother, the grandmother who showed up at the opening, right? And she would always say, just, you know, she would always advise me, don't cause problems, just be quiet, lie low, stay quiet, right? Just be content where you are, and if you can, you know, work hard, you'll get further ahead, and so on. So that's, in a funny way, that was also something which was the fault of Asians in terms of, you know, it's the kind of Pacific philosophy of life that also compounded the you know, attribution that they had to somehow had to follow.
Yeah. I guess, like, maybe this is like, continuing on that line a bit, we can talk a bit about the complexity of, you know, growing up Asian Canadian, Chinese Canadian, from a refugee family, and just like how, you know, you're thinking through some of these things in relationship to the violent histories of, you know, settler colonialism and Indigenous communities. I think in your book you talked a bit about, I think it's from 2013 as well, the Canadian identity debates are broken, let's fix them. And you talk about landscape in there and how it kind of evens out this difference about human subjects. And I think I wrote it down here where it's like, the disjunctive stories that cannot be constrained within a universalizing landscape narrative that cloaks their disruptive voices. Here, landscape is used as a unifying device, premised paradoxically enough on exclusion, not so much through racial or religious cohesion, but through sameness by relativization in the form of multiculturalism. And I think that this kind of flattening feels uniquely Canadian, and at least like in relationship to the kind of the aggressive individualism sometimes of American culture. But it's a kind of cloaked violence, you know, where very often Canadians have this kind of complacency or smugness about their liberalness, and that, you know, it's like a place devoid of racism, or that there's like some kind of like moral superiority or something to the US. And the US, you know, by all means, as we both know, is also a trash fire. But Canada's not without its share of, you know, systemic and structural problems, and history of violence and police brutality and land expropriation and all of these things. And but I think that, you know, as, you know, coming from immigrant families, you know, like how do you also navigate some of the complexities of that? Like, again, maybe this is still going back to the weird zone of the racial middle again, but, you know, thinking about how some of these conversations around Indigenous politics and settler colonialism, I think, has also factored into your writing and your thinking around the work that you do.
I mean, I think the funny thing is that I'm not even sure I was just I was naturally inclined to resist the prevailing order of the Canadian art system or cultural system or whatever. It was more because I just didn't know the rules. All right? It was just so foreign to me, and I was in a hurry. I wanted to know more about art, but then, and so I learned, because I learned by way of a series of shocks, right? So I'd have a curator come in and say, "Oh, I didn't know you're Asian," right? Or "What you're doing isn't very Canadian," or, you know, there's a whole roster of experiences that were shocking to me, and each time I was left feeling quite you know, lonely. I felt quite sad. I felt like an idiot. I felt like I wanted to go in a corner somewhere, and I felt that you know, I was too stupid, or I just didn't know, right? And then I would even blame myself for, you know, if I had a different upbringing, which was impossible, then maybe I would have known those rules earlier. But the irony is that because I didn't know the rules, and the way I learned it was actually a series of mini episodes of violence, I have to say, kind of, right, towards me, a series of shocks. Then I developed a kind of thicker skin. I started thinking about it. I started, you know, I'm not a great writer or thinker like Frantz Fanon or someone like that, but you know, it was out of the violence, out of the systems of shocks that he felt, that suddenly he gained some consciousness. I mean, Malcolm X, if you read his book, is like that. It's all premised on, wow, you know, I learned this and I learned that, and each time it was a wake-up call. And so that's how I negotiated it. And I don't recommend that as a method.
Just witness as much brutality as you can, everybody.
Yeah. No, obviously it wasn't like violence, like someone shooting you or and so on. But it was a kind of violence, you know, on who I was and so on. And in a way that was a better way of learning things in the long run, right? But in the short run, I often think about other artists of color, that not necessarily Asian artists of color, but all kinds of other artists of color who, or maybe from, you know, not necessarily working class, but maybe from small towns or whatever. And they basically gave up. They left the art system. They left, you know, they became a stevedore. They could even become successful. But the point is that they left because they just didn't believe in it and so on. And I think that's a tragedy because they had some things to say too.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are the things that in your book, it's so, you know, like how these lessons are learned, or like how you come to be witness to them or realize them. You know, I think working all across Canada, you know, I think that you've, especially when you worked for the railway and like, you know, just like these things that, like how you kind of arrived at some of this stuff, you know, it doesn't come through exclusively through these like aesthetic relations. It's like, you know, seeing grave markers, you know, it's like seeing these like things that can be really jarring. And suddenly when that like, when it's looking back at you suddenly, you know, when you realize and things start to come and not be theoretical anymore. And I think those are like some of the really most, I think, most powerful parts of the book, you know, because you know, we're talking about art, but it's like we're also not, you know, and that they're so married to each other, and how our understanding of how we make things has to also come from the stuff in life, you know. And I think that that's the part I think I always kind of really very much relate to.
Well, I
You
mean,
know,
last week I was reading this essay. Don't ask me why I was reading it, but it was about the Battle of the Palancar, which is a bridge. It's still there. It's being repaired just south of Beijing in China. And it was in 1860. It was the last great battle of the Qing army against Anglo-French forces. Right, the culmination of the 12 years of the so-called Opium War. And then, of course, you had the Tianjin Treaty signed right after that point, which basically ended the Qing rule, but also basically ceded political power to foreigners for many decades until at least 1919. And so, and I'm reading about this, right, just because I'm I like reading stuff like this. And then I'm reading about how the English and the French general said, let's get together on this. We know that they're stationed here. There's several thousand Qing army, and so we'll come in from one side of the bridge, and you force them on the other side. Their armaments are quite crude and so on. And then what we'll do is we'll force them to retreat onto the bridge, so they'd be crowded, shoulder to shoulder on the bridge, and then we'll just blast them, right? Mm. Right. I'm being a little bit crude, right? But in effect, that's what happened. And so, everyone died, right? It was like a gigantic massacre. Right. And so on. And so I read this and I'm thinking, how, so much of the world in terms of the dominant narratives we're supposed to follow, in terms of, even the question of what is civilization, it's so much is premised on bullshit, right? Yeah. So much, right? And it's just arbitrary, and it's and hypocrisy, right? And so, and I'm not sure what my point is, but I guess I'm always kind of reading these things and trying to make sense of everything, and I realize that there's I feel that that's what I do, right? I need to dig out all this information and so on, and I'm excited by doing this, right? And that's why the book takes the form it does, because it covers so much territory, because I'm just interested in so many different things and trying to map out so many different things. I don't see them as, and it takes the title that everything is relevant, right? Mm-hmm. Right, because I do think everything is relevant. I can't even sit on a public bus. Well, I can't sit right now because of the pandemic, but
no one should actually.
No, but I can't even sit on a public bus without actually looking over and noticing the people around me. And if I see someone with a very stooped shoulder, I'd say, gee, I wonder what job that person does all day that has given him or her such a stooped shoulder. I mean, that's just the way I do things. And then I go home and I think, I need to either make a work about it or write about it somehow.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hope that it encourages people to also view the world in such a way as well, because I think all of those things are meaningful. All of those things, as you say, are relevant, and they indicate a lot of other things that we sometimes are not vocal about and we don't want to express. But it's always very interesting the subtle ways that these things are materialized, like our subject positions. And I think that maybe this is like a chance to talk a bit about, speaking of kind of like these day-to-day observations that you have. A dear friend of mine who as well, Divya Mehra, she anecdotally said to me that, your semi-daily posts on your Instagram account are kind of one of the only reasons she checks Instagram these days. And it's a relatively new account. I know you kind of only started my long ago, but
my first social media account.
Your very first social media account. But I encourage everyone to go and check out Ken's account, because you're going through a lot of your work, and they have these expanded captions that share so many details about the works over the years, and how they came to be. Like, for instance, like if you are on the bus and you see someone with a shoulder, like you kind of provide that context for this work. And I think it just really underlines their sort of persistent relevance, not only just in the content, but kind of the questions that remain, like it presents a question and over time we're still asking the same question. I think you shared recently the news of the renaming of the VABF after one of your most well-known artworks, Melly Shum Hates Her Job. And, I think everyone agrees that Melly is such an incredibly special work. And, you've noted that she's been the subject of dedicated Flickr and Twitter accounts. And then when the work was originally taken down after its initial presentation at the VABF, the public had demanded its return. And someone claimed it was like essential to have a monument for people who hate their jobs. And I think it's so powerful to honor Melly as a worker, especially as many of the labor politics that pervaded her creation in the late 80s remain true today. And so, in this
today, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And so in this time, with, we're replete with like these demands for institutional accountability. Like maybe you could talk a bit more about your thoughts for like how these public spaces, these places that are civic essentially, can like, how can they be more democratic or ethical and collective? And like, how can these spaces finally honor workers and like not symbolically, but actually in practice, because I think it's amazing to name a space after a worker, but like, it also has to go beyond that somehow. And so I'd be curious, because I know, you work in public space all the time as well.
Well, I just wrote and gave a keynote speech, 5,000 words just last week on this topic of social space, public space, and so on. Well, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why I guess I co-started Monument Lab, right? Which was to deal with what I think of as a crisis in terms of the public space, because even the idea of publicness as a kind of condition of a space is something which is administered, and overseen and discursively constructed, and has very little, agency in terms of really fomenting true public dialogue, true public social practice on those types of spaces. And so, I think public space is in crisis, especially in this world of surveillance and data harvesting and so on, right? I mean, if you go by Saskia Sassen, the great Dutch sociologist, teaches in New York, she basically has given up, and she's basically says, the only true public space is what she calls terrain vague, right? Meaning, vague terrains of spaces that are maybe the end of some alleyway nobody dares to walk into, and that's where you can actually have the true practice take place, right? Or some brownfield, or some empty lot, right? That has garbage in it, and those would be the true public space, because nobody wants to administer them. They're not surveilled because nobody, wants to no city would put up CCTV cameras over those fields because, you're not supposed to go down there, right? I mean, I think that's a bit too bleak, right? But I do think, I define true public spaces, any space that has, a decent level of access points, but more importantly, that can be practiced upon and that can produce public dialogue, right? It could be public dialogue about space. And so long as that happens, right? And I think public art, right? Art, it can do that, right? 90%, if not more, can't do that because they're basically, they understand the rules, right? They're supposed to perform as public art, quote unquote, for some development or as an extension of civic projects and so on, right? But they're not really about challenging or expanding, challenging, the control of space or even endeavoring to expand space, socially speaking, and so on. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how to answer that. I don't have a formula for that, but it is something which preoccupies me, and that's why I co-founded Monument Lab, which was to really look at, the systems of representation through monuments, markers, through edifices that are named, and so on, and then providing a kind of analysis of them, right? Breaking them down, not just in terms of what they signal and what they communicate, but also in terms of what they suppress, what narratives, what counter histories, what alternative histories, what subjugated knowledges are not allowed to be expressed, right? And or what histories are continue to haunt, but are not evident in any material or iconographic or representational form.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely such, I think, you know, in this time where I think people so often just want to look towards the future and like, you know, how we can kind of change things in the future. It's like you still haven't contended with the past, actually, you know, and this kind of work, as you say, like as a type of haunting, but also that kind of archival work, which is so essential because we understand, you know, the value of like what goes on record and how that informs like how you actually start to dismantle something if you don't, you know, you don't have that full picture. I'm getting the signal that it's time to open it up for questions now. I don't know. Oh, Vivian's back.
Yeah, I'm joining you as a third wheel. Sorry.
Vivian's back.
From the public. So someone does ask, as someone who was once an outsider to the art world / institution, how do you navigate it? How do you navigate through it now that you are a prominent figure?
Well, it's easier to navigate through it than to navigate from an outside position, right? Because now I have some influence, and you know, people, you know, for better or for worse, there's enough people that like what I do or are interested in what I say, and so I have to maintain an ethical position. I have to stay true to myself, as Kim and I were discussing earlier, right? I don't try to forget where I'm from. I don't try to you know, make up you know, a new me that's not consistent with my values. I've become, in fact, more politicized, not less politicized. All those issues I was very interested in from the very beginning have been much more lucid to me now, and I feel that it's my responsibility to keep at those problems in the way I have been doing, but now with the added benefit of greater reception.
Yeah, and I wonder if you both could speak to this question, but also like in this specific moment where it does seem like that we're at this peak, or where the like institution does seem to be cracking a little bit. And, you know, I think folks are talking about collapse as a potential, and like this kind of restarting from a clean slate. Not that that's possible, but yeah, I wonder if both of you could speak to that in your respective places that you are now.
Well, that choice was something that the great James Baldwin wrote about, right? Whether you can actually renovate from within, or whether you need to destroy the entire system, and so on, right? I mean, I'm not a revolutionary in that sense. I'm not like I'm not going to go out there and, you know, start up barricades and fires and things like that, right? But I do think I'm maybe an intellectual revolutionary, and so on. So I don't know. I'm of two minds. I mean, there's one mind says, you know, that there are interesting people within this cultural system, which I'm a part of, and that I've always been interested in. This moment of the pandemic has actually opened up those spaces, I would say, right? So that, or at least I like to believe, so that, you know, the kind of entertainment as the big business aspect of the art world seems a little bit more irrelevant somehow, given the kind of you know, terrible conditions that are meeting people's lives right now, and so on. So, and that provides an opportunity, I think, to really rediscover what art can do and what really matters in the world. I mean, the world is, you know, the Amazon rainforest is on fire right now, right? And so on. So, right. But then on the other hand, I also think, you know, a lot of museums are now undergoing these kind of self-analysis and, you know, making promises of increased BIPOC representation, and that's all good, right? But then where were they like 5 years ago, 10 years ago? It's the same, you know, you know, so seeing is believing, right? I don't want to sound cynical, but I also would like to see some things right? Real change before I support it, by the way. I'm not saying I don't support this change of heart, right? But I like to really, well, I don't know. That's best I can say.
Yeah, I just want receipts. I want a lot of receipts. See that change. Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a challenging, it's a challenging thing to respond to, I think, because, you know, I actually believe that, you know, short of dissolution, like the work of the institution now should be, you know, it's what Christina Sharp refers to as distributed risk, you know, and that this kind of the many forms of like harm reduction actually that can exist within the institution, like using its resources in a particular kind of way, supporting artists in different ways, recognizing that actually it's not, there is no washing of its hands, you know, like there's actually no way in which its very foundation is just like toxic to the core, right? And at the end of the day, it's like none of you are giving up the keys and handing it over, which is what you should be doing, but it's not going to happen. And so in that time period, if lead up to that, it's like what can an institution do that more evenly distributes that risk, or like actually takes, you know, that kind of care in that sort of way that isn't actually about dominance, you know? And I think, I don't know if there's great examples of this institutionally, to be honest with you. I think that so many of these conversations based upon the composition of these institutions, and I mean that financially, human resources, like all of these things, it really prevents it. You know, there's a particular kind of limitation to getting there. So I don't know. I might be more bleak than Ken about this.
I think we have time for one more question. I wanted to ask you both. You both have like an excellent usage of the English language, and if it's not too traumatic to address, can you talk about your relationship with English and with language in general?
Well, the first person that comes to mind is Mrs. Grant, who was like a school teacher in grade 4 I had, and everyone was terrified of her, including me. And everyone just said, well, you know, whoever you want for English school, to teach English, you don't want Mrs. Grant. You want this, I forget the other guy, this other guy, and so on. And then it was terrifying. It was like, you know, wrote. This is a, you know, this is the predicate. This is the, you know, this is what we call syntactical composition, and so on. And I was nervous the whole time, and which is, you know, that's not normally conducive to schooling. But then years later, I look back, I go, wow, I really learned English from Mrs. Grant, right? But at the same time, I guess my point is that she would have been someone, if I was an adult, you know, I probably wouldn't look upon her with too much favor, because she would have been conservative, very, you know, stiff, you know, lipped English way of, you know, Presbyterian, I don't know, you know, teacher, right? And the same people that were missionaries in China, for example, in 1848, perhaps a little bit unfair, right? But so I saw her as a kind of I guess the way I learned English was, I saw her, just through using that example, I saw her as like a kind of colonial master who taught me how to speak the language of the rulers.
I think that really sums it up again. I don't know. I think there's like, over the years, you know, having a growing competitiveness about, you know, this idea of like mastering a language or something. But I think as I've gotten older, I'm also just like, maybe I don't use any of it correctly, and it's fine. I actually prefer to not use it correctly. And, you know, like in a way that to sometimes play around, I think, or to push against, you know, this kind of logic of grammar, and going back to kind of that Presbyterian kind of logic too, of like, that certain things have to be a particular kind of way, and how it sort of relates to a type of dominance, you know, and like how the language itself can be used as a type of refusal, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like everyone should maybe pick another language and learn that one before English, because it's a pretty ridiculous language at that. And I feel sometimes depressed that that's ultimately, at the end of the day, out of the handful of languages that I know, it's probably the one that I know the best. And so
No, but Kim,
colonialism works, guys. You know?
No, but Kim, I think there's two speakers of English. One is, you know, the white speaker of English who maybe grew up in Kensington, England, or wherever, right? And then there's also the colonized speaker of English, a person of color who learns how to speak English, right? And that voice is a very interesting voice, right? I mean, James Baldwin is one, right? If you look at YouTube debates with James Baldwin, it's unbelievable, right? Or and so on. So, you know, in French, you had the Pied Noir, you know, writers and born in Algeria, brought up in Algeria, and they were like incredible in terms of their French, right? I mean, like Derrida was one, right? And I think that is always much more interesting because they are speaking as colonized subjects at some point in their lives, right? And then they use it to speak and critique about dominant culture.
Thank you so much, you two. We do have to hop off for the next presentation, but really appreciate this conversation, and thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kim. Bye.
Thanks, Ken.